Hello and welcome to my channel. This is where we talk about reading, writing, and the general making of books. My name is Mary, and today I'd like to talk to you about the fish out of water trope. But first, a little bit of housekeeping. Please, if you like this kind of content, like, comment, subscribe. And there are links to pre-order my book, Escape from Hell, in the description below. We'll talk more about that at the end of the video. And yeah, I added to my set. I wanted to show you something real quick. So back here, I have the book I'm currently reading, which is Lucifer's Daughter by Kel Carpenter. It's a self-pub. It's going pretty fast. It's pretty short. I just started it yesterday, so I'm not really sure how I feel about it yet. I've enjoyed it so far. I'm like 3 or 4 chapters in. So yeah, hopefully by next week I'll have finished it and I can tell you what I think. There we go. I've been in a bit of a reading slump lately. I just can't really get into anything, so this one's really good so far, so hopefully it'll break me out of that slump a little bit. Today I want to talk to you about the fish out of water trope. Just a quick overview. I've got my notes in my lap if I'm looking down. Just what we're going to do today, we're going to define what the fish out of water trope is, give some examples, talk about some pros and cons to using it in your writing. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience using it in my own writing, and then I'm going to give a little bit of a wrap-up and final thoughts. So, definition of terms. What is the fish out of water trope? So, according to the TV tropes definition, it is when a character is placed in a situation completely unfamiliar to them. So often in media you'll see like that situation is they're in a new place or a new time, they're experiencing a new culture. It's just the fish out of water. They are in a situation that they are completely unfamiliar with, and they have to figure out how to make it work, and hilarity ensues often. So a classic example of the fish out of water trope that came to my mind first when I was thinking about this was Crocodile Dundee. And Crocodile Dundee does the fish out of water trope twice. It does it when Sue is in the outback and then when Mick is in New York. And it's a very classic example in that in both cases they are very at odds with the environment. It's not only something they're unfamiliar with, it's very antithetical to what they are used to. So it definitely is a good example just of what the trope is in general. So some examples of when the character is taken out of place are Enchanted, the movie, and that in that one we have the character going from a completely different place of like a fairy tale setting into the modern day. And then there's the character of Starfire from Teen Titans, who is an alien, and a lot of her fish out of water scenes are just her figuring out how humanity and Earth works. And then in Wonder Woman 2017, you get a little bit of fish out of water when Diana goes from her home to London and has to figure out what's happening there. Another way that this trope can be done is by displacing the character in time. So an example for this from what I've read would be Kindred by Octavia E. Butler, in which the main character is transported from her home in 60s or 70s California to the antebellum South. And she has to figure out how to stop that from happening because it just keeps happening throughout her daily life, and then figure out how to survive when she is in the past. And then another way that this trope can be done is when the character is just displaced by culture. A really good example of this for me would be The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, the TV show, in which there's not really a big time jump. He doesn't leave the country or anything, but he is just placed into a cultural experience that he is not familiar with when he moves in with his extended family. And that causes a lot of tension and a lot of opportunity for humor. And then this trope is also seen in kids' media. So an example I have is Curious George, where it is the monkey, George, who is displaced and is trying to figure out how to get by in the city. So, why would somebody want to use the fish out of water tropes? So I'm going to go over some of the pros, and then I want to talk about some of the cons. So one of the first big pros, especially in like fantasy or sci-fi, is that using the fish out of water trope really helps the author or writers provide a lot of world building. Oftentimes there are things that the reader wouldn't know and needs to have some exposition around that the characters would see as normal and everyday. And so having this character who's a fish out of water allows the author to have the characters explain to that character what's going on, and it doesn't feel like they're talking to the camera. An example of where this is used a lot is Avatar: The Last Airbender. Aang is displaced and he wakes up 100 years in the future, and then Katara and Sokka have to explain to him what's going on. For them, the current situation, what's happened, is very normal. It's just every day. There would be no good reason for them to talk about it, but they're able to explain what's going on to Aang, and that brings the watchers, who also don't know anything, up to speed alongside Aang. So the fish out of water trope is used a lot in that way to help build, to allow the author a chance to world build through dialogue without feeling like they're preaching to someone who's not there. And it allows there to be just this character who can ask the questions that the audience is probably thinking, so that the audience doesn't get lost and confused, and the characters don't feel like they're explaining things they shouldn't be explaining. Another reason to use the fish out of water trope is as cultural critique. So the example I mentioned earlier of Starfire from Teen Titans, she will often ask a question that seems obvious to the watcher and the other characters, but highlights some instance where the culture she's immersed in, is being unkind or unhelpful to other people. So this is used a lot to just show two different cultures side by side and where one can learn from the other. And then third reason to use this trope is because it is an excellent source of humor. It allows potentially a secondary character, if it's the secondary characters, the fish out of water, to step forward a bit more. It gives them some sort of keynote to be what brings them into a conversation. And it can just be funny, just the juxtaposition of someone who has no idea what's going on against everybody else is fully immersed in what's going on. It can be a definite source of humor if it's played that way. It doesn't always get played that way, but it can be very funny, and it can allow there to be beats of humor where there usually wouldn't be. So those are some of the reasons why someone would write a fish out of water narrative. Some of the cons are that it can result in a one-note character. So as I mentioned before, if a secondary character is the fish out of water character, and the only reason they're interjecting into a conversation is to make a funny joke, or they're only used to provide exposition to the audience, that character can become uninteresting because they just have that one thing going on. And it can make that character flat compared with all of the other characters in the story. It can also result in a cheesy, campy tone if too much time is spent with a character who just doesn't know anything about anything. It can be really hard for the tone to move into something that's more serious, especially if the trope is played for humor a lot. If then something serious happens, it can be hard to shift the tone away from the humor that the trope has already introduced as a regular thing. And then finally, it does open up plot holes, or the opportunity for plot holes. So if a character is introduced as fish out of water. They don't really know what's going on. That can be used as exposition early in the story, but if the character is too out of the loop, if there's just too much that they don't know, later in the story, when the author no longer is interested in using them for exposition, they might still not know things, and then you either have to slow down the story so that they can learn, or it just leaves this plot hole where, well, how did that character not know the basic facts at the beginning of the story, but then by the middle of the story, nobody told them anything, but suddenly they know everything. So it does leave this open opportunity for plot holes. So, the fish out of water trope in my own writing. So my book, Escape from Hell, coming out October 18th, is the story of Rin. And at the beginning, she starts out as a villain in a fantasy setting. And in chapter 2, she is assassinated, and the instant before her death, she is taken by time travelers to the future, where she is sentenced to a prison called Hell, with all kinds of future technology and all that sort of thing. So she's coming from this typical fantasy setting into this sci-fi setting, and has to learn how to get along in this setting. So there's a lot of fish out of water elements in this story as she tries to escape from hell and get back to her own time. Rin is the biggest fish out of water element, as she's the newest person in hell, but all of the prisoners in hell are from different time periods and different places. So they all have this fish out of water element to them, but it's focused the most on Rin because she's the newest character. So, some of the things that I really liked about using this trope are, first of all, one of the challenges I had was that Rin is a villain protagonist. She is the villain in her fantasy setting, and then she ends up in hell. So she's not a very relatable character. And giving her this fish out of water trope to work with allowed me to introduce some more empathetic and compassionate parts of her character earlier in the story, to allow the audience a chance to feel something other than disdain for her. She's not a very likable character in the beginning, but because she's put in this awkward position, it allows the reader to feel some level of compassion for her and some interest in her. So I really liked using this trope to soften a more villainous character earlier in the story, to allow the audience to connect with her. It also provided a lot of opportunities for bonding moments between characters. So since she's in this new place, she's just thrown into this new setting, she doesn't really have any connections with any of the other characters starting off. So by having this fish out of water element, I was able to have other characters teach her things, and this helped build relationships between the other characters that didn't already exist. Whereas if you're diving into a story where all of the characters already know each other, there are other techniques you can use to show those bonds. But to show those bonds forming and forming quickly, I used this trope to allow the other characters to teach her things. And then the last pro that I really enjoyed was, I did enjoy it as a source of humor. It's a source of humor that appeals to me when I'm reading and watching TV and movies, and it was a lot of fun to write. It was good for me to be able to introduce these just humorous misunderstandings every now and then, and they can be just small points of humor. They don't have to be like a big gaffe or something, just a moment where someone just doesn't understand or misunderstands. Doesn't really have huge implications, but does help to lighten the mood of a story that can get a little bit heavy and a little bit dark. So I really enjoyed using that to lighten the mood a lot. And then some of the cons I had. This story has a very tight focus on the perspective of Rin, which meant that there were a lot of things I couldn't quite explain just because she would have no way of knowing it, and nobody would want to explain it to her. So there were elements of the setting in hell that she just didn't know, and she was never going to know, and that meant that the reader was never going to know it. So I had to make sure that those elements were things that it wouldn't negatively impact the story for the reader not to know this piece of exposition, just because this character is a fish out of water. She's very focused on getting out of hell. She's not going to be going around trying to learn all of these different things about the place that she's trying to get out of. So there was a little bit of a challenge in exposition, just that this main character that we're following and we have a very tight, close focus on from her point of view, just doesn't know everything. So that was a bit of a challenge. And then another part of the challenge was that it did slow down the pacing in places. As I mentioned before, one of the things that can happen is that plot holes develop when we don't show the character learning something that they wouldn't know. And that does slow down the plot when you're trying to stop and explain something that maybe the reader does already know, so we don't really need that exposition. For example, Rin doesn't know what the internet is, and the reader does know what the internet is. So while there is some opportunity for humor there, you do need to move very quickly through those parts, because it can really drag the plot if the side characters have to stop and explain something. So I had to find ways to either explain those with humor or just in narration mention that another character had already explained this to her to avoid having those plot holes. Alright, so final thoughts on using the fish out of water trope. I really enjoy it. I enjoy reading it, writing it, watching it. I really like this trope. I like the way that it introduces humor in a natural way, and I love the way that it provides exposition without feeling awkward. It's a lot of fun to write, and it can also be done well in small doses. So it doesn't have to be the main character who's a fish out of water. Having a smaller side character as a fish out of water can be really interesting also, and that can really help show some of the different perspectives on the culture or the place where your story is set. An example I didn't mention earlier is the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. That's a really big epic fantasy, and through it there are a lot of smaller characters that will often have a bit of a fish out of water experience as they're thrust into a culture different from their own. And it really helps provide a more well-rounded understanding of everybody's culture when you're seeing it from the perspective of someone who is an outsider. So there's a lot of ways that this trope can be used that are really interesting and really fun to work with. So I recommend it. As I mentioned at the beginning, please like, comment, subscribe if you enjoy this kind of content. I'd love to have a discussion in the comments about fish out of water tropes. What are some of your favorite examples? Have you written with it? Did you enjoy the experience? What are some watch outs that you've come across in your own writing? I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. And then my book, Escape from Hell, out October 18th. And pre-orders are available in the description. There's a link to my website where you can pre-order the paperback. And then there's a link to Amazon where you can pre-order the ebook. It will be available on ebook and paperback on Amazon on launch day, and then it will be available on my website to buy directly from me on launch day. Join the discussion below. Have a great day.